several. Yeah, that's what I call, a setup. Thank you
Oh,
so
it
much.
looks so funny.
Okay. Did you by any chance, before I get into the subject matter as such, did you by any chance have a chance to see the thing from Frontier Strategy Group? Was that of any interest, or like, what the hell is this crap?
Is that open to international students?
Yep. To
Is
me.
that okay with working visa and stuff?
I think there are a couple of,
Oh, so it's not paid.
I assume it is, but, because if it isn't, then I kinda like the idea of not doing it, right? Because 20 hours a week is gonna make you feel like you have very little room for error. One second, I get to you. And so if you want to, start getting a sense of what jobs can I do, what jobs I want to do. Can I do those, do I want to do those in the United States? Do I want to do those in Washington? Then I will send, to tell you the truth, and then I will send your resume to Lauren. It's just not gonna be, how costly could it be? To, from, subject matter, attached. Right? That's the extent of the cost, right? There's nothing magical about it. So if you see in that webpage anything that you say, oh, I like doing that, or you anticipate that once you finish this program, you may go to another country, and in that country they have an office. They have offices in Washington, Miami, Singapore, and London. So, and if you are into that, then they can be of help. They are very young, they are very energetic. They deal with problems on a daily basis that, for which there is not a bookshelf and here's the answer, let's just write it down. So, okay, all right. Ron, I'm
So I
sorry.
was just gonna say that they have 2 internships posted on their website. They're both 20 hours a week, and then both are paid.
Both are paid.
Both.
Do they indicate how much?
No, they don't.
Yeah.
One is global risk and analytics, and the other one is some regional, I think Middle East or more of a regional specialization.
Okay, so this is sometimes they use names that I don't understand. Right? So this global risk strat, I just get lost right after the second word, so I don't know what that means. But they know what that means. I just don't. But if it is of interest to you, and I work with them, and there are several science students in there. Okay. So, here it is. The issue of international policy coordination. Is this, yeah, this is probably a little small. The issue of policy coordination ultimately involves a question about what model to use and what is the response of economic variables to the variables that are supposed to be capturing those policy effects. What Frankel and Rocket did was to argue, is to say there is a long list of models. This is the one that I used to work on, the multi-country model. Here is the European economic community. This is the Japanese model, the Economic Planning Agency of Japan's model. And then there are several others. This is the OECD, there's the John Taylor model. And there are a couple of things that I want you to see here. The first one is all of these results, all of these tables are showing the effects of an increase in the money, I'm sorry, an increase in the money supply of 4% on output. And this varies from virtually negligible here to large 1.8, or this other model 3. So this matters because the choice of model is what's called ultimately going to drive the decision to implement a policy coordination or not. And so here is the first glitch, that using the same data, people have different views about how the economy works. And what that in turn means is that those views translate into models, and those models differences will translate into the effect of monetary policy. This is bad news. This is bad news for people that want to use this framework, because these numbers cannot be easily reconciled. And the same is true if we were to look at the effect of an expansion of the money supply on the rest of the OECD countries. I mean, check this. I don't know how else to describe this. The effects vary from -13 to 5. In other words, this is a simple way of stating the obvious, namely, we don't know what the hell's going on. And so rather than saying it so bluntly, rather than saying it with words, you just put a table. So that's going to be an issue. What I'd like to do now is to try to recognize that issue into how do we go about in setting monetary policy coordination. And what I'm ultimately driving is at the idea that these models, one, we don't know which one is the correct one. Second, it is possible that I'm using the correct one if you're not. All of this is going to create a fair amount of tension in deciding whether we want to follow monetary policy coordination or not. And monetary policy authorities normally stay away from tension. So they're not going to follow this. Instead, they're going to follow something over which they have considerably more control. Nevertheless, for the purposes of the course, I want you to know that we're going to have this framework in here, and here we have, this is the reaction function for home when home uses model M2. Tanya, how are you? Nice to see you. And here we have the reaction function for the, in this case, Europe, when they use not the same model, but model M3. And so I'm denoting here 2, 3 to denote that home uses 2, foreign uses 2, 3. This is a Nash equilibrium. And so in principle, there's going to be a point that makes both countries better off, in this case, point B, which is B is for bargain. While I have this diagram, what would happen if the slopes of these two lines were, what would happen if these lines were parallel? Namely, what happened if the two reaction functions were parallel to each other? Alyssa? No what? No, I don't know. No,
I don't
no,
know, sorry.
or no, I'm not Alyssa. No.
I don't know, sorry.
Okay. Sharju?
There is no Nash equilibrium.
Exactly. So if you have these two lines parallel, they don't intersect. If they don't intersect, there's no Nash. If there's no Nash, there's nothing to talk about. Okay? And then the question is, what determines the slope of these schedules? And it is something that we could have figured out. I mean, I don't mean this instance, but from here. Here's the equation for optimal monetary policy for the home country, given a level of assumed monetary policy for the foreign country. And so the slope of that reaction function is this term in here and that term in there, so the ratio of those two. So there's nothing that prevents those slopes from being equal to each other. Okay. Second, take a look to this. Here's the optimization problem. So this is the value of the domestic internal target. Here's the value of the external target. Do you think that this solution is adversely affected about what we assume for that, for the weight? In other words, what happens if we were to abstract from this optimization thing? So is it possible to go and carry out an economic analysis of international policy coordination without knowing the objective function? Well, there are two ways to doing that. So the role of the objective function shows up in here as W. And that's the only place where that objective function shows up. And so I wonder whether we need this W in there. I think this is just so that you start thinking that don't view these equations as coming straight from the mountain. These equations are, to me, an invitation to ask questions. Do I need the objective function to do this? Because I don't know the objective function. Or in other words, I don't know the value of W. Another way of doing this is that here we have, suppose that the value of B and C and G and H for both the foreign and domestic country are the same. So you would think that the slopes are going to be the same, but they're different in the W. So that allows for a Nash equilibrium to exist. In other words, I am trying to suggest to you not to view this as the answer to the question. View this as an answer to a hypothetical problem that is going to be slightly different in the exam. Right? So that's what I'm steering you. Okay. Now the next issue is, for example, in order to derive these indifference curves, we need the objective function, but the calculations that are carried out in this particular paper somehow do not make that assumption. So I'm just wondering, well, okay. Okay, so check this out. This involves a fair amount of combinatorial analysis. So the model that I use, the model they use are two possibilities, and there are many of them. So in this red box, both countries or both policymakers use the multi-country model. And so the move from the Nash equilibrium to the bargain equilibrium involves, when this is the case, an expansion in the European money and a contraction in the US money. So we go through this gymnastics, and here it is. What to me seems like, what was the point of this? These are the gains from international policy coordination. This is the in square percent of GDP. So in order to get it as a percent of GDP, we need to take the square root. And so, which is another way of saying divide by 100. And so I'm looking at this and I'm saying, this can't be right. I mean, numerically it's right. The calculations are correct. But for monetary policy authorities to engage in monetary policy coordination to get something that it is 0.001 of GDP, that's about $6, maybe $6.20, right? Or €3.08, right? It's not big, right? It is just not big. And so one of the points of this paper was to essentially put some cold water on what was at that time this driving force for monetary policy authorities to coordinate among themselves. The logic is impeccable. The analysis is formally consistent and rigorous, but the evidence is just so against the idea of cooperation that you wonder, what was the point? Unfortunately, this is not the end of the story. The end of the story, or the beginning of the new story, is going to be here. That we have, that Europeans or the rest of the world can have beliefs about different models. They don't have to use one model or the other. And there is this, the truth. We don't know what the truth we don't know what the truth is, but the argument here is that even though we don't know what it is, it exists. And the same thing could be for the United States. And so the elements along the main diagonal are instances in which both countries agree on the use of what model to use. But that's not likely to be the case. And most likely is that the United States prefers one model and the European or the rest of the world prefers a different model. Because if you were a European guy, you will say, no, I'm not sure that I want to use the model from the United States because the model is probably geared towards explaining the United States, so whatever crap comes out of it is going to be biased in favor of the United States. And so this is the most likely case. The ones that are not really likely are instances in which the United States has a claim on truth, but the Europeans are unaware of it. So situations on this block in here denote cases where the United States knows the truth and the rest of the world doesn't. And here is where that situation is reversed. So now we have three possibilities. Country 1 uses model M1. Country 2 uses model M2. Reality is model M3. Okay? And the question is it possible that when you have when reality differs from the models that are being used, that the resulting policy actions will lead to a decline in welfare? That's the big deal that this paper is about. So here is how would that look. Okay. This guy's in here. This is the true value, the true Nash equilibrium, and this is the true bargaining set. But this is not absurd, right? Because this guy said, I'm using model M1 and I'm using model M2. There is an underlying truth that is not absurd. And so if they go by their own lights, this will be the Nash equilibrium they think they have, and this will be the bargaining equilibrium they think they have, and they act on it. Now the glitch is that as they do that, so they implement monetary policies to reach point B. Notice that the indifference curve associated for the foreign country to point B is farther away from nirvana than the red here. So they are worse off. And the same is true for the home country. This is the true indifference curve. This is the one they end up as a result of coordinating monetary policy. So they are screwed. They are screwed because they're acting on a belief that it is not the reality. Now, the point here is not to say, well, if I knew reality, then I don't need to do any of this, really. If I knew reality, I'm done. The point is that because we don't know what the true model is, then we need to allow for the possibility that the choice of models for the policymakers is the wrong choice. And so the question is, well, what is then the alternative? The alternative is not going to be reality. The alternative is going to be a cooked up example. So here it is, the way they do it. Here's the model, the four potential models that Europe can use, the European authorities can use. Here is one model of the United States. So this guy is alternative models that the United States could use. And now what we do is to say, well, we're going to say that reality is one of those models. We don't know which one. So we explore all the possibilities. So this first yellow entry here denotes the case when Europe uses the MCM, the United States uses the MCM, and reality is the MCM. So this is the Holy Trinity in action, right here. It is conceivable, however, that Europe may decide to use a different model. And so here we have Europe using the OECD, the United States using the MCM, and reality being the MCM. And so you get these different numbers. And so far, no big deal, right? So far, no. Here's the big deal, this negative entry here. So Europe uses the MCM, the United States uses the OECD. This one beats me because why would they be using somebody else's model? I don't know, but that's not what this is trying to argue. And so here they have a case where there is a loss involved. Here's a case when there is a discrepancy between the model used by the United States and the model representing reality, they lost. And it was this finding, I think, that gave rise to a certain distancing of the profession and policymakers in general to adopt this type of framework. It relies on knowledge about the loss function. It relies on knowledge about the transmission channels. And it assumes that one of the models that is going to be used is a true model. So this form of international policy coordination was not followed too much after this paper. Which then raises the question, well, are there, this is one hell of a morning for me. Let's see if Diet Coke, BFF saves the day. Let's see, and if it doesn't, well, then it doesn't, right? So, but it is one thing to say this particular form of international policy coordination seems to have more risks on the downside than the upside. And quite another to say we can act on our own. And so policymakers, by and large, act on their own. Let me say that by way of one of the most effective forms of policy coordination that I know is when central bankers get together in Basel, in the Banks of International Settlement. The Bank of International Settlement is, or functions like a central bank for central banks. And so they go there and talk and negotiate and think about the world as they see it, and then they come back home and do their thing. But their thing is now being influenced by what the Bank of Japan told them. It's being influenced by what the Bank of the Swiss National Bank said. And so they're taking this into account, but in a fairly informal way. And that was pretty much the way it worked until the financial crisis. So let me take you there. This is not it. Let's equals this. Isabel, how are you? I'm glad that you showed up because we have been waiting all this time, and look, this is the first page of the file. All right. This is central bank liquidity swaps. What I want to do now is show you the magnitudes, and then right after that I'm going to show you what gave rise to this. At their peak, central bank liquidity swaps were about $600 billion. The entire asset side of the Federal Reserve immediately prior to the crisis was $800 billion. So this is huge by any standard. Okay? Huge. Unprecedented. So, and so the liquidity swaps are an agreement between the central bank, the United States, and central bank of a variety of countries. In this case, let me just make it a little bigger. So this is A liquidity swap is when the United States lends dollar to a central bank, and in exchange, the central bank gives us their currency. So a liquidity swap between the United States and the Bank of Japan involved the United States giving dollars to the Bank of Japan and the Bank of Japan giving yen to the United States. I'm gonna go into the details in just a second. So it's not a loan in the normal sense of the word to Japan, to the Bank of Japan. It is, they give us their currency, we give them our currency. And there are gonna be several details as to how this gets unwound. But in the meantime, so the way it works is that the Federal Reserve creates what's called liquidity swap lines with the following central banks: the Bank of Australia, the Bank of Brazil, the Bank of Canada. I think this is the Danish Bank, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, Korea, the Bank of Mexico, New Zealand, Norges, the Bank of Maharashtra, Singapore, the Swedish Bank, and the Swiss National Bank. So the only bank that they didn't include was me, right? So it was just pretty much. Part of this is to avoid creating a stigma on a particular central bank. So if you imagine that of all these central banks, only the European Central Bank was the one that needed the money, then that creates the impression that the problems in Europe are particularly so severe that the ECB is the one that needs the money, not the Swiss National Bank. And so to avoid creating that type of thinking, they said, we're going to open liquidity swaps with respect to everybody. So it's to diffuse the attention. So this is in December of 2007. Then in November of 2011, notice that the list of banks is not nearly as long. So we still have the Bank of Canada, Bank of England, Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, and the Swiss National Bank. So notice that Mexico, Brazil, Singapore are not part of this anymore. And it is because this is associated with the European banking crisis. All right. What I want to do now is what gives rise to this type of development. Let's see. It's going to look a little involved. It is not going to be complicated, but it is going to involve keeping track of who would lend money to whom and when. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go slow, because what I want to do is to create the environment in which these liquidity swaps came up. It's not that the central banks were thinking, why don't we go and have some liquidity swaps this afternoon, and then they go, oh yeah, that sounds like a neat idea, let's do it. So they start doing scrap. This is gonna take a little work on my part, so I want you to be patient, okay? I want to start at time T0 with American Bank 1 here, extending borrowing from American Bank 2. Okay? And I'm going to denote that this as a loan from A2 to A1. And so American Bank 1 gets cash and sends to American Bank 2 a piece of paper that says, I will be paying you this much on these dates. He sends an IOU. All right. Then American Bank lends to German Bank 1. So, or in other words, say German Bank 1 borrows from American Bank 1. And here is the borrows in dollars, okay? So the dollars go from American Bank 1 to German Bank 1. Now you can see the way I'm crafting this is that I want these dollars to have originated from Bank 2. So what happened is that German Bank 1 wants to borrow, okay? Wants to borrow in dollars. German Bank 1 doesn't know a thing about American Bank 2, but knows American Bank 1 and said, I need to borrow $500 million in dollars. And American Bank 1 says, no problem. I don't have it, but that's not a big deal because I can borrow it from American Bank Two. So American Bank One borrows from Two and sends the money from German Bank One. Okay? All right. And the question is, what would German Bank One do with this money? Well, German Bank One somehow read a brochure of AIG or Lehman Brothers, denoting that, man, these MBS are the way to go. And so the German Bank One wants in the action, and so they buy MBS from American Bank Three, who is really happy to get rid of that crap, and German Bank One sends money to American Bank Three. All right? And so if we one word to summarize these transactions, can you see that crap? Why didn't you say something? Because it's almost over? No. Stop it. You're letting me down.
This one?
Yeah, you just said, hey, you're showing me crap. You're talking about it so you could see it. And,
I'm talking, I'm seeing there. I'm looking there.
oh, you can see it on the monitors?
Just
It's actually not that bad. I can see it pretty clearly.
Prospective student. What did you expect? It's just gonna come independent. Okay, well, so, all right, so this is, please, I said my apologies. This is, for next time, right? Next time, let me know because most of the time I can do something, but I can do something if I know that it's not showing up in there.
I think if we just dim the front lights, it would be better.
You mind saying that again?
If we just dim the front lights, it would be better. Dim the front
You think
lights.
this is a magic wand that I can?
I'm pointing at the lights she's referring to.
No, just pointing at the light, but, you know, what I need is not.
Yeah.
All right, so can,
Now I can see it.
see what I mean, right? It's just one little, yeah, it's fairly crappy. Again, please accept my apologies. The idea that I'm trying to do here is to highlight the interconnection between foreign banks, in particular European banks and American banks, okay? And have that connection be through mortgage-backed securities. That's one of the first thing I want to do. The second thing that I want to do is to highlight that it was in the interest of the Federal Reserve to engage in this liquidity swap. What I'm gonna show you in a moment is that it was not a favor that the Federal Reserve did to the other countries. It was not a generous act. Is that had the Federal Reserve not done that, then American banks would have gone under. Okay, that's the main point. And that's what brings in here the element of international cooperation. The European banks need us, we need to work with them. All right, so let's see if the next, just see. This is the same thing that I have. Jesus, this is so bad. Is the TV there a little better, Lex?
Yeah, the TV's fine.
The one you're complaining about? Or?
I have mine better than me.
All right, so let's go with. I mean, I'm looking at here. You're saying the same thing I'm saying. Again, please accept my apologies. This is just not the way to go. And so at time t0, American Bank 2 had a change in the composition of its assets. Less cash, and swap cash for loans to American Bank 1. American Bank 1 had a change both in liabilities and assets. Its cash holdings went up. This is the loan from B2. And it now has a liability to Bank 1. German Bank 1, at time T1, experienced an influx of cash because it was it borrowed, but it borrowed from Bank 1, so it also has a liability. And so at this point, American Bank 1 has a decline in cash and an increase in loans to the German Bank 1. And at time T2, German Bank 1, having read the AIG brochure on the merits and wonderful things from mortgage-backed securities, decides to go and buy some. It lowers the cash, raises its holdings of MBS, and the opposite is happening in American Bank. All right. So what's the genesis of the crisis? The genesis of the crisis is that for a collection of historical reasons that are a little outside the scope of this, mortgage lending in the United States became essentially widespread. The standards for borrowers were considerably diminished. And as a result of that, individuals borrow and they use these loans to buy houses. At one point, the appeal of this mortgage was that you could buy I'm just gonna make this up, $1 million house in Phoenix, and you have to provide virtually no evidence that you could pay the loan. This became known in the United States in retrospect, and it's gonna sound a little pejorative, so let me apologize. It became known as ninja loans. No income, no job, no asset. You can go and get your $1 million house, no problem. And so many individuals who were from the outset unable to service these obligations got these loans. The big deal about these loans is that after 3 years or after 2 years, you have to go and refinance, or the interest rate of the loan rises. The belief was that you didn't have to worry about the interest rate rising because housing prices were increasing. And so the way it worked is that you wait 2 years, the price of that house increases, and then you're saying what you do is you refinance. So you don't have to, you just borrow again, presumably using the equity that is now in the house. Well, the housing prices began to decline, and the moment the housing price began to decline, the market value of those mortgage-backed securities falls. Okay, mortgage-backed securities are securities that are the value of which, the return of which, is pinned down by the value of the houses associated with those mortgages. So if the value of those houses is going down, the value of the mortgage-backed security is going down along with it. Okay? No big deal so far. All right. So let's take a look to, so what gives rise to this crisis? You remember that the search for yield German Bank 1 had a liability to American Bank 1. And that liability is now due. This is coming out of the blue. Normally the way it would work is that German Bank 1 sells those MBS, uses the proceeds to pay American Bank 1, and settles the liability. Here's the glitch. The glitch is that now those mortgage-backed securities have declining value, and therefore they're not, the value is not as high as the loan. Moreover, that was not a really, that was not limited to German Bank 1. The situation is widespread. European banks, for one reason or another, I don't know the reason, thought that they were going to make millions by buying crap from the United States. So when the crap really shows its face, now these European banks have a liability denominated in dollars. They also have an asset denominated in dollars, but the value of that asset is declining because the mortgage-backed securities are declining in value. And so you have a liability that was supported by an asset, but the value of this asset is now declining. So selling that asset is not going to be able, it's not going to enable you to pay for the liability. All right, well, German Bank 1 says, well, we are so sorry about the whole thing, but we're going to default. So what? So that sounds like a German problem. Not quite, because if the German bank defaults, then the loan that American Bank 1 made to that bank, the German bank, now is receivership. In other words, the assets of American Bank One go down alone. And let's assume that American Bank One defaults. Well, if American Bank One defaults, then the assets of American Bank Two also go down. And so if American Bank Two defaults, and you can see the chain extending all the way. This is the context in which those liquidity swaps arose. The glitch is that the European banks borrowed in US dollars. So their liability is in US dollars. Their assets are also denominated in US dollars, but the value of their assets is declining. Why couldn't the Federal Reserve says, what exactly do you want me to do? You did the wrong thing, so why would we go and help you? Because if the Federal Reserve does not do it, then American Bank One goes under, and if that one goes under, then so is American Bank Two, and so is American Bank Three. That's the setup. And so what they're trying to do now is, well, why should we do that? All right. This is a little better. Good. Underlying all of this is that I cannot lend to American Bank, to any bank, because I don't know the quality of their assets. German Bank One says, oh, I have tons of assets. And I said, yeah, but a good chunk of it is MBS, and I don't know the value of it. So I feel not exactly enamored by the idea of lending to you. So there is this general unwillingness to lend, because we don't know who's holding what. We don't know, of those that we know, we don't know the composition of their assets. For those that we know the composition of their assets, we don't know how solid is those mortgage-backed securities. And so there is just this is what Chairman Bernanke used to say, the financial system is about to freeze. Okay? What was needed, and this is part of where the corporation come in, is to generate liquidity from the outside of the financial system, from someone that has no risk. Okay? And so that was not a problem in the United States. The Federal Reserve could extend a loan to any US bank, and so here is your liquidity. The glitch was that the European banks had their liabilities in dollars, and the ECB is not really a dollar lender of last resort. They can create euros, they cannot create dollars. And so that's when there's this. I'm gonna leave this question here for you to, enjoy a little. So why couldn't the ECB lend euros to the banks and have the banks change them into dollars? No, we're not gonna answer it now, but I want you to think about it for a little while. If European banks have a dollar liability, the ECB could lend to the European banks in euros and have those euros, have the banks go to the foreign exchange market and convert those euros into dollars. How come that was not pursued? All right, so here's the structure of a liquidity swap. The Federal Reserve will get, I'm gonna focus on the ECB. The Federal Reserve will get euros from the ECB, and it will give dollars to the ECB. The contract is clean. So the day on which this swap takes in place, one says the process of doing it in reverse will be done at the original exchange rate. Okay? It's not that they're going to they're going to unwind the positions at the exchange rate in the future. So they're eliminating exchange rate valuation effects or exchange rate losses or gains from the transaction. This particular aspect of it was some people did not like this. Some people in the United States did not like this. The contract will specify for how long the swap will last, the exchange rate conversion that is at the same day, and an interest rate. So the Federal Reserve is essentially doing a collateralized loan to the ECB. what will the ECB do with this? The ECB will then engage into an auction with the European bank. And so, in this case, the ECB will auction the dollars. German bank one probably will be at the front of the line. So the German bank gets the dollars from the ECB and sends an IOU to the ECB. So now German bank one is owes to the ECB. German bank one pays to American bank one, American bank one pays American bank two. This little line in here is how the United States benefited from it. Because by helping European banks, it helped US banks. Okay? So it was not, oh, we're gonna save Europe financial system. No. We're going to save our financial system. And the way it's gonna work is gonna be through Europe. And so there will be German bank one, German bank N, all right? And so at the end of the date, at the end of the duration, the way it would work is that the ECB will send dollars back to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve will send the euros back to the ECB. There's one outstanding question here, and I don't have an answer for that. And I think Rohan, somebody asked me this question in this group. What assurance are there that the ECB will have enough dollars to unwind this? Rohan, was that you? Okay, fine. There was no Rohan. And so you see the question that I'm asking. I'm making this look as though it was an obvious thing that the ECB was going to have enough dollars to pay to the Federal Reserve. But imagine what would happen if it didn't have enough dollars. How would that work? Well, I think the answer that I gave was, well, I mean, if the ECB goes, we go. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's like if the Federal Reserve is insolvent, then we are all insolvent. Now, it's not nearly as dramatic as I make it sound. Because the ECB could borrow dollars from another institution, from another central bank. And so you can imagine that if the ECB doesn't have the $6 that are left on the loan, it could ask the Swiss National Bank, could borrow from the Swiss National Bank for the remainder of the balance and send that to the Federal Reserve. This is, that situation did not give rise. Here it is to give you a sense of comparing the magnitude of the liquidity swap to all the liquidity facilities. Right? So the blue line is all the loans extended by the Federal Reserve. Remember that this number here, this 800, was the size of the balance sheet before the crisis. And what we're seeing here now is just one of the entries in that balance sheet now. We're not seeing treasuries, we're not seeing MBS, we're seeing liquidity facilities. That crap went all the way to $1.5 trillion, and then it declined. The European affair seems mild by comparison, okay, in terms of the liquidity swaps. My sense is that, we have talked about this in the past, well, how do you know that the central bank is credible? Well, you can see here that the extent to which the central bank gave credit declined over time, right? And so, remember, these are additions, so the positions increased big time. And so this is, when people talk about credibility of the central bank, they look at this and say, these guys are not trying to raise the money supply so as to get the unemployment rate below UN. These guys are literally avoiding the crisis. Okay. So this, my apologies, go.
Can you go back one slide? Sorry, I just was a quick question about the swap at the end, when the European bank is paying back.
Yeah.
And you said it's at the same exchange rate as before, but is there also paying interest, right?
Right.
Can the Fed sort of determine what that interest rate is?
Oh, it does.
So if it sees like a big valuation change in the exchange rate, can it sort of make up that with an interest rate?
No. I mean, no. I mean, these are broad. This is family, right?
Okay.
The central bank is family business, right? So at this point, at time T, when the swap takes place, then the contract between the Federal Reserve and the ECB specifies for how long the swap takes place, the exchange rate conversion, so that's the same day, and the interest rate. So what you're asking is, can the Federal Reserve manipulate the interest rate so as to compensate for any loss in exchange rate? The answer is no. I mean, the answer is they didn't.
Okay.
And the Martians are attacking us from the standpoint of the central bank, and we're gonna be negotiating interest rates now. One second. David, you had a question?
Same question.
Salvin?
Yes, so I'm just thinking like one of the alternatives for Fed is instead of doing the swap and let ECB save their own banks, is to let the European banks go bankrupt and inject liquidity to the U.S. Banks so that they are not affected. So why don't they do that?
Let me see, just to make sure that I'm following the question.
Mm.
Why didn't the ECB let the European banks default? And then the second part is what I didn't get. Then you want the ECB to lend to the American banks or the Federal Reserve to lend to the American banks?
The Fed.
Oh, well, okay, so from the standpoint of the solvency of the US financial system, it would have worked just the same. So instead of going from Washington to Frankfurt, back to Washington, why don't I think the central bank has a responsibility towards their own countries, right? Like the idea that a central bank was gonna let many banks bankrupt and then accentuate the economic problems of that country just to make a point sounds a little draconian. Sounds a little too much, right? I think remember the ECB doesn't have a lot of its own. The ECB is made up of the central banks of the different countries, and so there's a governing council that is gonna say, we're gonna let banks in Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Ivana, where is Slovenia? Serbia. Banks in Serbia go under. That sounds weird. Yes, we'll vote for that. Sounds really weird. And so they're not gonna do that. So they have a duty to protect the economic interests of their own citizens. So, go ahead.
Sorry, but just out of curiosity, I guess, I understand this realization, but when the Fed let Lehman Brothers fail, was that not, were they just thinking this is gonna fail and everything's gonna be fine? Was that the realization? And then when Lehman Brothers failed, they're like, oh, the whole system's gonna go down? Was that when that really struck? Why did they let Lehman Brothers fail then?
Okay, so, Cali, right?
Yeah.
The prospective student. Trying to kind of create an impression here. Okay, so the answer to your question, there are several answers to your question. One is the true answer, and let me say it right now that I don't know that. And then there are the claimed answers to the situation. The claim answers are that it goes like this. The Federal Reserve was looking for someone, for some financial institution to go and acquire Lehman Brothers. Okay? And there was no one in the United States that could do that because they believe at that particular moment was that Lehman Brothers assets were close to zero, whereas the liabilities were really large. And so the idea that I'm going to be buying a bank and I'm going to inherit virtually no assets a building and tons of liabilities was not particularly appealing to US banks. For one reason or another that and this is when I say I don't know, Barclays was interested in acquiring Lehman Brothers.
Yeah.
Maybe they had a different valuation system for their assets. I don't know. But then for Barclays to acquire Lehman Brothers, they need to get approval from, this is where the exchequer, need to effectively get approval, not so much from the Bank of England, but from the Finance Ministry of the United Kingdom. And that permission was denied. Okay? And so at this point, one, the British say, that looks like a bad deal to me. Second, the Federal Reserve says, we don't think that there are many assets in there. Third, we don't want to create that much more moral hazard going forward. So let Lehman fail. This is my take. Okay. Now, if you want, we can go right now and visit the Federal Reserve transcripts of these conversations. These are available now publicly for 2008. I haven't gone and checked this, but they are. The answer is in there, and my sense is that one, at that point, the Federal Reserve did not have the authority to acquire an investment bank because the Federal Reserve's obligations are to regular banks, regular commercial banks. So it's not that the Federal Reserve could extend a loan to Lehman Brothers. Oh, but they did it to Bear Stearns. We'll get to that in just a second. So there's the legal limitation. There's also the magnitude of the liabilities, and perhaps a failure to appreciate the extent to which Lehman was going to catapult the subsequent crisis, or a failure to understand how deeply interconnected Lehman was. Okay. And so if you see here, let me see if I can bring it up. So Lehman went under. So check this. I mean, here's the evidence. There's some liquidity facilities in here. You know, nothing by comparison. So notice this is the liquidity swaps, and this date, September 10th, 2008, is when Lehman goes under. Right there. And what was not appreciated was the extent to which Lehman's collapse was going to affect the European countries, and therefore US banks, because the European countries have tons of MBS, much of which probably was originated in Lehman Brothers. And then where did the Europeans get the money to buy that crap? From us. And so we're on the hook to it. And so it goes from, oh, I don't know, let's just call that 50, you know, to 600 billions in a week. It's unreal. Okay. Yeah. There was another question? All right, so why don't we take a quick break, and then we're going to go and deal with fiscal affairs.